Thank you everybody for coming this evening and welcome. And so I'm Colin Butfield. I am the co-author of this little book here. I wrote it with some chap who he's not done much before. He's hardly known at all. But tonight I've got the slightly unenviable task, so have a little patience with me here, of trying to keep these two incredible gentlemen and myself on subject and on point on talking about the ocean, communicating the ocean, discoveries in the ocean, some of the threats facing the ocean, and the process behind filming and writing stories about the ocean. First, on my right-hand side, is Keith Scholey. He has pretty much done anything you could imagine to do with wildlife filmmaking, particularly underwater filmmaking. He was head of the BBC Natural History Unit. He's made more series on the natural world than practically anybody else, probably David Attenborough excepting, and is now the director at Silverback Films. Michael, you've got one of those biogs that if I start now, I might carry on far too long, and we use up our hour and we're done. Oh, well, but I will pick a couple of ocean ones out. One of the first things that really brought home to me the scale of the ocean, and particularly the scale of the Pacific. Michael did an incredible journey. Did it actually take you a year? Was it a full year around the Pacific, full circle?
Pretty much so. Yeah.
You sort of hear that thing, don't you, where the Pacific is so big it can fit all of the other ocean basins into it. In fact, it can fit all of land on Earth into the bit of it. Yeah. But you don't really realise that till you see the scale of the journey that you had to undertake to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I really realised the scope and scale of the sea when we did Around the World in 80 Days. And we were trying to follow Jules Verne's journey around the world, and he went from Yokohama to Los Angeles, and it took him 21 days. Yeah. And we went on a container ship and it took about 12 days. So it was very useful because we actually caught up time we'd already lost messing around in Hong Kong and places like that. But yeah, I mean, the scale of the ocean is always something I found quite incredible. And starting as we did in full circle at the Bering Strait, this sort of vital sort of stretch of water between Russia and America, between the two land masses, and then following down and going round Cape Horn eventually, right up to the north again. You realised how significant the ocean was for people who were trying to sort of find out more about the world, and how in many cases the ocean frightened people a lot. I mean, there was the great case of this cape in North Africa, Cape Bojador, I think it was called, and the navigators from Portugal and that just couldn't go around this cape. Nobody could sail around it because they didn't know what was on the other side. Yeah. They didn't know whether there'd be enough wind to bring them back again. So this Cape Bojador became a sort of bogey place until a man called Gil Innes, I think it was, went round it and said, "Hey, it's fine. The wind's blowing. Oh, we're going south."
I made it back.
Yeah, and so made it back. But that was, a huge moment for people's sort of fear, dealing with their fear of the ocean.
Well, it's one of the things that David and I put in the book. We were talking about how ocean discovery lagged so far behind the discovery of life on land for obvious practical reasons like the one you said, but you lose track of how different it was. So there was a point, where we are now, sort of Buckingham Palace, Regent Street, most of these buildings were built at a time when nobody knew if there even was a southern continent. In Erebus, you start to explore a little bit of that, about you tell the story of that sort of sense of not knowing what was down there at the far south.
Yeah, I mean, the Erebus, the ship, the Erebus and Terror, the two ships that were chosen to do what was essentially a scientific exercise at the time. Yeah. There were ships going down to the Southern Ocean. The clippers were going to Australia and coming back, and yet this was a purely scientific, and they wanted to see whether there was a southern continent, whether Antarctica actually existed.
Exactly.
And in the end, they found that it did, and they sailed around it, and these were the first people ever to see, parts of, to set foot on the southern continent. And so I was just fascinated by what it must be like to be the first people ever to have made this very difficult journey and landed on Antarctica. And, they were just guys, from sort of Whitby and...
just guys from Whitby.
And they had parties and they've got sort of pictures of them enjoying life there, but they were away 4 years. Only 4 people died during that time in the expedition. They came back. It was just an amazing success, but had, as you say, revealed the southern continent for the first time ever.
And it's been one of those things. I mean, ever since that point, we've been almost every single year discovering more and more about the ocean and sort of winding us forward a century or so, just quickly skipping forward that bit. We started to really start to change the way that we explored the ocean, and in particular how we then started to communicate it, because we began to actually be able to go beneath the ocean, record things and film things. And Keith, you weren't quite there at the beginning, but you got a little bit closer. I don't want to overly age you there.
Yeah. But Joe, when I was passionate, I grew up on Cousteau films. And as soon as, at that stage in the 70s, when you were 16, you were allowed to go scuba diving. And as soon as we were 16, a whole bunch of us went down to St Austell in Cornwall and went on this diving course. And at that time, we thought diving was quite sophisticated. Looking back on it, it was pretty primitive. In that basically you just had the air tank and some straps and a weight belt. None of this sort of life jacket or anything like that. And actually, in some of the tanks, you didn't even have a sort of contents gauge. Now you have a pressure gauge, you see how much air you've got left. There was this sort of reserve thing on the back of the tank, which was great. So basically, the principle was you went diving, and when you started going, you pull the handle down, and then got air back, and then you knew that was the time to head for the surface. The problem was if you had got someone had knocked the thing and it was down, so then you go put the reserve on no more air. So
dangerous. It's good that you're still alive, really, Keith.
I think diving, do you remember when the North Sea diving started with the oil rigs?
Oh yes.
Every week, divers were dying, weren't they? It's gone a long way since then.
The wonderful thing about ocean, really, the book and the film, is just it's an enormous revelation as to what is actually in the ocean.
Yeah.
And I remember, we used to have holidays. I was born in Sheffield, which is about as far from the sea as anywhere in England.
Yeah.
So going to Sheringham in Norfolk for our holiday was a great thing. I couldn't wait to go over the hill and see the sea for the first time. Yeah. But when you got in it, you couldn't see anything. I mean, it wasn't associated with fish of any kind at all. You'd look underneath the water, a great gulp of salt. You couldn't see what there was there apart from the odd starfish when the tide went out and all that. So that's what the ocean is, such a revelation of what's down there. And I mean, you must know.
We've still barely scratched the surface of it. But I mean, when you were first diving, Keith, which was a similar sort of time to when I think David was making some of his first films, and that you actually got to dive on a pristine reef. I mean, I think the sort of diving I've done now, the reefs are definitely impacted, even though they're beautiful and stunning. You actually dived on a pristine reef.
I did once, and it was we were making a film very early in my career in Borneo, and there was this amazing, the godfather of underwater photography was this guy Peter Scoons, and he was my cinematographer, and he knew everything, and he had started diving in the late 50s. He was with the RAF and lived in Singapore, and he had been on a lot of pristine reefs. But we went out on this boat. It was a sort of oil rig recovery boat. It was a strange mission, but we knew there was this reef about 30 miles offshore. It was so far offshore that it couldn't be fished by local fishermen, so it was pristine, and it didn't have any land at all. It was just a reef that just rose up. And I vividly remember we finally got there, found it, and anchored on it, and literally just put a hook on the top of the reef, and the boat drifted back. Yeah. And I said to Peter, right, should we go? And he said, no, you go in and take a look. And so I thought, okay, I'll take a look. And I thought, funny. And then just literally before jumping in, he said, you're never going to forget this. And he gave me a sort of a little wink. And I thought, oh, great, well, of course, it's going to be great. Yeah. So I remember jumping in, and he'd obviously had this experience many times before. And there was this lovely little ridge of the reef, the most beautiful reef you could ever imagine. I got to the edge of it and looked out, and suddenly, woof, the shark comes hammering out of the blue, and stops. About 4 feet in front of me. It just looks at me,
just staring at you,
and then goes poof and gone again. And this happened 5 or 6 times. And I always remember that when a shark really sets off, you can hear the tail. The force of the tail is like a bang.
Yeah.
And it went boom, boom, boom. And so this happened quite a lot of times. There's clearly every shark in town had never ever encountered a diver. And so they thought, food. And then, oh, not food.
None of them wanted to eat you at all?
No, they just took a good look and thought, no, thank God. You imagine if...
I'd have been a bit
Fortunately, there's something in a shark brain that makes one look at this diver. But everything, the first few dives, everything was completely tame. But the paradox of the story was there were some other people on the boat who'd come out to spearfish.
Right.
And they started, and obviously spearfishing was really easy because everything was tame. So they were coming up with all these big fish and what have you. And then the next day, everywhere we dived, even miles away from the original dive site, nothing was tame. Word had got out. That humans were here.
Yes.
And it's absolutely extraordinary. And then you think, it's a huge community. We talk about reefs being community, but word had got out and nothing was the same.
It was just as well you hadn't cut yourself shaving.
My dive was nice.
Yes. No, I was thinking...
It was extraordinary how pristine can go in a flash.
Yeah. I think, again, this idea of fear of the ocean, or awe of the ocean, I mean, that's films like Jaws, of course, played on that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the effect of Jaws and the popularity of that film just didn't do much for our awareness of undersea life. If you go in there, they're killers, they're against us, they're the enemy. And I think what you've shown in the book and what you do is that's not the case, is that?
No, not at all. And actually, interestingly, the author of Jaws, I don't know how many people know this, he went on to spend the rest of his life working on shark conservation because he felt so guilty about what he'd accidentally and unintentionally set in place. But healthy shark populations are actually what keeps, particularly reefs, healthy, what keeps the oceans healthy. You've got sort of almost the opposite of a trophic cascade that you get on land, where actually having the large predatory fish is part of what keeps the reef healthy. So one of the things we talk about in the book is the idea that almost the sharkier the reef is, the likelihood is that that's going to be a particularly healthy reef. So the fact that as humans we're sort of roughly taking about 100 million sharks every year out of the ocean. So you're talking about 1 billion top predators every year out of the ocean. And we haven't quite worked out exactly what the effect of that is, but almost inevitably that is going to have huge consequences to the ocean. But before I dive, excuse the pun, even further into that particular analogy, I've got one little clip. So as probably you might know, we've been making a film about the ocean in parallel with this book. It's actually it's not the book of the film. It covers a whole load of different stories that when we were making the film, we felt you can't actually film that. Maybe we could tell it in a different way. And we came up with lots of different sort of narrative ways to tell that. But we have been making this film and we thought it doesn't come out till tomorrow, so we could, given it's our film, we could show a couple of sneak clips here. So we've got, first one to kick it off is from the early days of ocean exploration, talks a bit to what you were saying, Keith. I wonder if we could just play that, please.
After forever.
I don't know if you saw it in there was one shot that you could see a couple of octopus, or about 5 or 6 octopus, all sort of balled up at the bottom. And there's an extraordinary story behind that. And with any big project, when you start working on it, and particularly starting working on something like a book, there's definitely a part of you going, is this actually going to work? Are we really going to make it work? And there's one moment where suddenly the penny dropped and we thought, yeah, okay, this works. And it was speaking to a guy called Chad King. And Chad King is an underwater explorer. He works in America for NOAA in America, and he controlled underwater submersibles. So he took a submersible, unlike the one you saw there, down to the bottom of the Davidson Seamount, which goes down to about 2,500 meters. And it was an exploratory dive. He didn't know what he was going to find. In fact, his colleagues had actually told him, you're probably going to find mud. bit like Norfolk, but deeper. You're not going to find an awful lot down there. And he agreed, but he thought, well, but you don't know till you look. And they put the submersible down, and they start sort of shining a light around, and he tells this brilliant analogy that it's obviously so dark down there. You've got two powerful lamps, but Davidson's Seamount is about the size of Manhattan. And they started shining this light around, and they saw, first of all, sort of a handful of these they look like upside down footballs. And what is that? And they shone the lights a bit more, and they moved the submersible closer. And then they realized there were hundreds of them. And gradually they realized there were thousands of them. And these upside down football looking things were all octopus. And octopus are largely solitary creatures. They very rarely come together. So it's thousands of them. What are thousands of octopus doing, a couple of kilometres below the ocean surface? It took them a couple of dives to figure out what was going on, but they realised this went for miles. They explored all around, and these octopus were all along these ocean seeps, which is where slightly warmer water comes out of the ocean and out the sea floor. And they were all female octopus, and they were all brooding. They were all giving birth, or in the process of brooding before giving birth. And the only conclusion they've been able to come up with was that so octopus quite often die after they give birth. It takes them so long and there's so much energy that they can't recover afterwards. And the theory was that this means that they can they manage to gestate faster. The birthing process is faster. It's less draining on them, so they can survive. We still don't know for 100% sure if that's true. But this point that he went down to a random place and found something beyond anyone's capability to even imagine was down there. There's not a scientist on Earth that even thought that was a possibility. And we've explored, as David said in the end of that clip, we know more about other planets or the moon than we do about the deep sea, which shows how much there is to find.
I wanted to ask something which I found fascinating in the book, that every sort of inch of the ocean floor right across the world has now been mapped. Is that right?
It's
or
nearly
photographed?
Very nearly finished actually. So there's a project to finish mapping the ocean floor by 2030. They're an enormous amount of the way through it. So that's not showing what lives down there, but it's showing the topography, the mountains and the canyons, using multi-beam sonar to map the bottom of the ocean. It's an incredible project.
But bearing that in mind, I'll ask you both. I mean, is there more to find out? I mean, like the octopus story, or are there many other sort of mysteries to solve?
Yeah, I mean,
Still?
I think there are countless other mysteries to solve. I think one of the interesting things is we got into that sort of early advent of communicating about the ocean is we went from we don't even know the fear sort of factor of what's out there to actually starting to tell the story of the things we could find. And that seems to have been a theme in the storytelling ever since. I mean, Keith, you've made a number of programs where you're sort of first revealing new behaviours or new things down in the ocean.
Yeah, I think the extraordinary thing was still finding new things on coral reefs, which is and new species and what have you. So what is actually in this submersible range, where it is, as Colin says, it's these little spot dives looking at tiny little spots.
Yeah.
So I imagine there's all sorts of masses of stuff that we just don't know anything about.
The coral reefs are very interesting. They're very much a part of the book and the film.
Right.
I mean, what's happening to them? Generally, my impression was that they're in a very bad way and they're being destroyed for various reasons. But you had a slightly more optimistic view in the film and in the book.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think the one thing that's become really apparent is the thing that really knocks coral reefs out actually is fishing. Yeah. Everyone sort of used to say it's pollution, it was silt, it was what have you. No, it is fishing, fishing, fishing. Because what we now know is that a coral reef has to be a community, and basically the resilience of the reef is by having all the players. Like Colin was saying earlier, you need the sharks, you need the predators, you need the grazers. And this has become really apparent now, because when you get these heat waves running through coral reefs, they go through this period called bleaching, where they lose, the coral has this little plant that lives inside it, and the coral basically overheats, and if it doesn't expel the algae. It's
so the heating
toxic for
comes
it.
from within the coral
No,
itself?
it comes from the water temperature of the sea.
Okay, all right, yeah.
But then the algae becomes toxic to the corals. It has to get rid of it. And if it's only a fleeting moment, it'll reabsorb it and go on. But what happens if you don't have grazing fish?
Yeah.
Very quickly, that coral gets algae setting on it, and then it's finished. And I remember my mate Peter Scoons, who I mentioned earlier. It was 1998, and it was a very big El Nino. The first time I think we all really got to know what a big bleach is. And I remember he was in the Maldives filming for the Blue Planet series. And he just got in touch with me and said, look, I'm supposed to be filming dolphins, Keith, but all the reefs have just gone white because no one had really seen a big bleaching event before. And I said, well, film it, Peter, don't worry about it. And he then came back with this amazing footage of this. It's stag swan coral, the one with bleaching, and it was completely white with these beautiful coloured fish in it. It looked absolutely amazing. And then he showed me pictures, film that he had taken 2 weeks later, and it had all gone. So the Maldives used to be, in the 80s, everyone used to go there to see the stags and coral.
Yeah.
All that, those buildings they build out over the shallow reef, and you can have They used to be over coral reef. Now, to this day, they're just on rubble. But no one knows. Everyone still goes there to the Maldives. Says, oh, marvelous! I'm in this thing, and it's over lovely sand and rock, and there are fish swimming around. It's marvelous. But those things are built on graveyards, and it's this thing. Scientists call it shifting baselines. When you see something for the first time, you take it that, oh, this is it. This is pristine. This is marvelous. Yeah. So if anyone went to the Maldives in the 70s or 80s, you'd expect just to see coral right up to the beach. Now people will go to the Maldives and they just see rubble, but they still think it's marvellous because they don't realise it's a graveyard. And scientists talk about that there's this continual problem of shifting baselines. And what you have to do to work out how to conserve them is to try to go back to what was it like 400 years ago? What was it like, 600 years ago? That's where we need to get to, because trying to restore it to what it was like 20 years ago is not where we should be going. So I just think that kind of moment. But Peter was there at the moment when the whole thing in the Maldives collapsed and filmed it, and it was quite a powerful moment.
Yeah. Fishing, as you say, was probably the main contributory factor to the decline. Is that?
It takes away the resilience.
Yes.
Exactly.
But fishing itself, the bottom trawling and all that. I remember when we were doing, I think it was pole to pole, and we went on one of these big trawlers up in the Barents Sea, and they were just scraping. They had fantastic technology on board, computers and all that. These nets would go out and they would scrape the bottom of the sea. And eventually, Michael, here we are going to show you what we've caught. There's hardly anything there. It was ridiculous. And in the film, certainly in the book, you describe very, very sort of vividly what happens to the ocean floor when it's just scraped clean.
It's crazy.
Exactly. Well, it's like there's a big difference between fishing. So, like you, on many of your programs, you've ended up going to fishing communities. You did in the recent one in Nigeria, the big floating village, and that's different. That's often people fishing, catching small amounts of fish, hooks and lines, nets, feeding their communities, like we've done forever, and many fishing communities across the UK do. But the comparison between that, where you're essentially just pulling out targeted fish that you particularly want, and between what you just described, bottom trawling, where you actually disrupt the entire habitat. It's dramatic and different. And actually, we've got a quick clip. Actually, we can show a little bit. This is again from the film that's coming out tomorrow. This is actually of scallop dredging. So it's similar to the process, Michael, you described.
No, that's grim.
It's obviously pretty disturbing footage, but I mean, one of the things we're trying to show and talk about is the difference between when you've got, the ocean is built on complex communities, like the coral reefs Keith was talking about, and keeping those communities intact. You can still fish, you can still catch fish, you can harvest seafood, but when the entire ecosystem is disrupted, you obviously get that sort of collapse. But you'll be glad to know we're not going to leave on that. Thank you very much. Good night. Hope you're all the wonderful thing about the ocean, and the thing we try and get across as much as possible in the book, is actually the incredible resilience and hope. And the reason for that is that biologically, once you understand how the different ocean ecosystems work, you can really see why they're capable of bouncing back to life in a way that's actually far faster than life on land. I mean, if you sort of went to a field, let's say 30, 40 miles from here, just a regular farmer's field that had been ploughed multiple times over, it would probably take at least 50 years before that looked something like a woodland. It would probably take more like 120, 130 before it looked like a genuine old growth woodland. If you did the equivalent off of most of the coast, not the same in the deep, but off most coasts in the world, that recovery, within a decade or so, you'd start to see really good recovery. Within 20 years, you'd see incredible recovery. And that shifting baseline that Keith was talking about can actually work the other way around. And I want to start by giving you one example. Can we put this still up? Now, there's a certain gentleman that kindly co-authored a book with me with a big stick and even bigger elephant seal. And that particular photo is in the book, and the reason it's in the book is because it's the basis of a story, which is South Georgia, so just down towards Antarctica. The South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands, actually part of a big underwater ridge that's running down through the Southern Ocean. And that area had been heavily concentrated for fishing, whaling, sealing, in particular damage to seal populations and to whale populations. So for hundreds of years, ever since the main discovery vessels went down there, those tales of huge abundance were followed by people going down and getting the whales and the seals for their blubber. And that was, of course, they had no other way of obtaining oil at that time. When all of that first started, that was people harvesting the ocean in a way that they needed for the industrialization they needed at the time. Populations absolutely collapsed, as you'd imagine. But now, when you go back, and I think both of you gentlemen have visited there, the abundance is extraordinary. The bounce back has been unbelievable. So that was an incredible sequence in a wildlife show, where now, if you go back, it's immeasurably richer. The populations of seals, the populations of whales are far, far in excess of what it was then. So you start to see that a recovery really, really can happen. And I think one of the main lessons from all of this really is that wherever we protect the ocean, the bounce back can be extraordinary. And
yeah, and I was going to ask, is there any likelihood of there being some international treaty? I know that they're meeting up in June to discuss these matters that would really try and restrict this bottom trawling and this imbalance.
Yeah, there is a good chance. I mean, whether it will all happen by June is possibly not, but there has been a global agreement to protect 30% of the ocean. So almost every country on Earth has agreed to protect almost 30% of its ocean. And now, in a few weeks' time, actually, there's the United Nations Oceans Conference in Nice, where lots of countries are meeting to discuss how they'll end up protecting it. And I think one of the things that we all hope is that by communicating the challenges of the ocean, but also the benefits for protecting it, you might get that sort of global outcry, because we've obviously seen it once before. And I've got one final clip, but I'd love you both, because you were both witnesses to some of this, to reflect a little bit on this one. Can we play the final clip, and then love to get your takes on it. Keith, you had a pretty much front row seat for a lot of this.
Well, I can vividly remember I was a zoology student in the 70s, and just been so depressed, just like David, that we were hunting the last whales into extinction, and it just seemed completely insane, and it was very few nations that were doing it, and what was the point? And then this miraculous moment happened when so much public pressure built up on the International Whaling Commission that they decided in '86 to actually ban it all. And I remember I was a researcher at the time with a natural history in it by then, and my job was to go and find footage to make a program about whales in this amazing moment. And I remember there was this extraordinary shot. Famous underwater cameraman called Al Giddings had got an underwater shot with 3 humpback whales in frame. And that was just amazing. Yeah. And someone else had filmed a blue whale tail fluke off Sri Lanka. And these were just marvelous, amazing things. And to think now that we go out now and film sort of 30 humpbacks in one shot, and I've jumped in an aggregation of sperm whales, about 40 animals, and I could never have dreamed that was going to happen. And I just think that's the bit that gives us all hope. But the funny thing with whaling was, it's just like what fishing is now. It's the same thing. You've got a tiny, tiny section of the population, for various reasons, hunting everything into the ground. But if you protect, you'll get loads more. It's slightly, it is insane.
That's true. I mean, that whole sequence is such an extraordinary symbol of recovery and hope. And I mean, I think David is always really good at is giving you the warning, but then saying, don't lose hope. And I think it's really, really important. And that just shows how fast things can be turned around. I mean, the early pictures you saw there of whaling, it was a huge industry and horribly violent, and they've just harpoons into these whales. And now you have these beautiful creatures moving around, and presumably their existence or their recovery in their numbers will mean a recovery in fish generally, or life beneath the ocean anyway.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the weird thing. When we decided to save whales, it was done because we thought we should save whales. Now ecologists know there's this thing called the whale pump, where whales feed deep and they come up and they basically defecate in the surface area and produce plankton blooms, which boost fish numbers. And so they are incredibly important part of boosting productivity. But we didn't know all that in the 80s.
And what you sort of piece together when you look at the different habitats is how recovery in one leads to recovery in another. And through the book, we sort of break off the sort of 8 big ocean habitats. And what you start to realise is, as mangroves recover, they help restock coral reefs, because quite often mangroves are at the same latitude as coral reefs. They function as fish nurseries for a lot of coral species. They repopulate the coral reefs. As the coral reefs start to get more restocked with fish, they become noisier. And that noise has turned out to attract other larval fish, or fish just beyond the larval stage, from the open ocean to swim to those reefs. So actually, larval fish swim towards the reefs that are the noisiest and most popular. So you get a self-perpetuating circle where the healthier reefs get even more healthy. And you start to realise this whole thing could actually build up and up and up. And to your point, Michael, that if we did protect roughly 30% of the ocean and the sea mounts, the coastal seas, you could get an extraordinary recovery. The scale of recovery could be beyond, you could create an ocean beyond, richer than anything anybody alive has ever seen. And
but then you have the problem of when the boats go out and say, well, plenty of fish now, let's go and trawl as much as we can.
Well, actually,
I mean, how do you stop that?
Well, I don't know if you necessarily need to stop it, because I think outside of the protected areas, okay, you've got to restrict the kind of fishing we saw there, where you're damaging the sea bottom. But actually, it's perfectly viable that you could catch more fish than we do today, if you did it in a sustainable manner, if you did it in a way that wasn't impacting the whole habitat, and you had these protected areas. So, I think overall, I would say Ocean, whether that's the film or the book, or possibilities, is a story of hope. I think there's a chance that we could get recovery in the ocean far beyond recovery, or in a far faster time than we could get recovery on land.
You presented a very strong case.
But it was interesting, with the whale story, it was solved by the stroke of a pen.
Yes.
It was a bunch of people got together in a room with a stroke of the pen, and it changed the world. And actually, the whole fishing story can be solved with the stroke of the pen.
Yeah, exactly.
It just needs the leaders with the pen to sign the paper.
Would you say that the pen is mightier than the trawl? Sorry. In terms of the film, I think we feel we've done the best job we can do at this point in history. I think there's probably another story to tell I really hope there's another story to tell in sort of 5-8 years when the recovery happens, and it happens even greater, and you can actually document that. But I think at this particular moment in time, I think we've done as good a job as we can probably manage, I think. And as for the book, it's slightly different because that's full of lots of stories of discovery and new things that have been found. And the amazing thing about the ocean is there are new species being found all the time. I mean, literally thousands of new species, new interactions, new understandings, like the whale pump example Keith said earlier. So I think you're almost endless sources of new discoveries within the ocean.
So you're going to carry on writing more and more books?
Not making any films with you. I think there are more stories of discovery, but we've probably done our job, I think, on the film.
Never say never.
Never say never.
No, exactly. Well, you know, someone I know is 99 still making programs. I mean,
no, well,